Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. That is the main man, of course, Greg. We had a great time at the Combine last week. We learned a lot. I'm sure you had a lot of good conversations with coaches and executives throughout the course of the week, and I had a lot of good talks with people about this number one overall pick that the Titans are still sitting on as we sit here today, March the
Right.
6th.
Yeah, that's going to, I mean, in many ways, that will dictate how the draft plays out because if they keep it, you know, that means they have someone they clearly want. If they don't keep it, it means not that they don't have someone they want, but that they feel they could get that individual at pick two, three, four, however it plays out. Um, so they really hold the key to the draft. And, as you and I have briefly discussed, we're going to be getting more and more into this as we indeed get closer to the draft. Um, it's really going to be dependent on, I think, whether they feel that there's a quarterback that is transcendent. And I don't mean that in a way that all of a sudden he's, Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, but that he could become that kind of player. Or if not, because they need volume, they need players. So if you don't feel that there's a quarterback that fits into that category, then you need players.
Yeah.
And we'll see. And free agency becomes really important for them. There's a number of players that's a lot of key positions that are going to be out there. Neither of us know at this point how Mike Borgonzi, what his worldview is, but there are a lot of players out there that could help the Titans.
I do think that we have a little information. Just, we're starting to get more of a picture of how Mike Borgonzi views this thing, Greg, because he's talked a lot about being selective in free agency, and that wasn't their MO last
Right.
offseason. They signed a handful of contracts at the top of a bunch of different positional markets. And, obviously they needed players. They didn't have good enough players on their own roster to pay. So you understood some of the moves that they made, but
Sure.
this year it's being described or told to us as a more selective
Well,
approach.
that's interesting because that might mean that they're willing to spend, big dollars on two guys, let's say, and we don't
Yeah.
know who that might be. Um, Look, one could argue with the safety position. Javon Holland's out there. He's really a strong safety player. I don't mean strong safety in terms of free or strong. He's probably one of the five or six safeties in the league that would be viewed as sort of five-tool players, using a baseball term, meaning he can do anything at the safety position. He's not specific to, oh, you've got to use him this way. He'd be one of those guys that could do anything. Player like that. I don't know what their stance is on Holland, but that kind of player, I would assume you're going to have to pay a good amount for.
Early indications specifically to Javon Hollander are that they are interested. My friend Cam Wolf at the NFL Network had mentioned that the Panthers and the Titans are
Well, that
both
would make sense to
interested in
me. I
Hollander.
mean, again, now you start getting into the negotiating stuff, which I don't really get involved with, as you
Sure.
know. But I mean, just looking at the player.
Yeah, and I'll ask you more specifically about the player here in just a second. We're going to touch on a couple of different pending free agents, given that this is the first or the last show that we'll do before basically free agency begins on March
Right.
12th. And of course, those deals will be agreed to before they can actually sign pen to paper in the legal tampering period. So, Greg, just quickly though, for the audience, the just indications that I'm getting right now on the Titans and the number one overall pick is that their preference is still to trade out. Um,
Right.
they're not falling in love with either of the quarterbacks more than the tape, and they're already interested. And now that they've been through the interview process, it's a bit late in the game for them to just be like throw their hands up in the air and be like, "Oh, this Cam Ward guy, what were we missing earlier?" They
Right.
kind of have a good feel of
And that's
where they're at
okay,
with that. Yeah,
That,
and I
yeah.
think that's okay for where they are right now. Their preference is still to be, as you mentioned, just to try and regenerate this roster as organically as they can because they have so many needs across the board.
Yeah, and there's pros and cons to both sides. Like I said, if Cam Ward to me is clearly the number one quarterback prospect in the draft. But if they don't see him, as I said, as that kind of quarterback, the guy you have to have no matter what, and by the way, that's okay. I may see him closer to that, but you know, reasonable people can disagree on that. And if they don't see him that way, then you certainly don't want to take him. That's the thing. You can't reach for him. If you don't feel that way based on your evaluation of the player, the person, everything that goes into a team's evaluation, and you come to the conclusion that he's not that guy, then you definitely do want to trade out if you can.
Yeah. So we'll use that as an entrance into the free agent conversation. And Greg, the only two players got franchise tagged, which is the fewest amount in the last 15 years that we've been doing the
Wow.
franchise tag, with T Higgins and the Bengals and Trey Smith with the Kansas City Chiefs. I think the T Higgins specifically, and you could speak more intelligently than I on this, I think it kind of speaks to what the Bengals think of the NFL draft class at wide receiver and just kind of the wide receiver class this year versus what might be available in free agency. It feels like it's a similar discourse to last year's running back conversation, where it wasn't a great running back draft class, but you had a bunch of free agents out there.
Yeah. And I also think with the Joe Burrow factor, because Joe Burrow is the kind of quarterback that I think because he has such a good feel that he expects his receivers and counts on his receivers to sort of see things the same way. And that doesn't happen in the course of one season. I don't know, for instance, Jermaine Burton, I think they drafted in the second or third round a year ago. We're not there, Buck, so we don't know exactly why he didn't get meaningful snaps. But my guess is it's because it takes time because Burrow is one of those precision players. Everything has to be mapped out exactly right. And obviously, T. Higgins, he's played with T. Higgins since he's been in the league. And we know that he advocated for Higgins to be there. But even if the team felt that they couldn't pay, I guess it's 26 million is the number for T. Higgins. But even if the team felt they couldn't pay, then you get into a situation where you've got to put someone else in, and then you have that issue with Burrow where, hey, is he where he's supposed to be? Is that because that's the way Burrow plays. In some ways it reminds me of Tom Brady, and one reason why Brady would always they'd keep the same receivers, even though people said, oh, they don't have great receivers. But all those guys knew exactly where to be, how Brady played. Brady understood them. It worked together perfectly. So, you can always get receivers theoretically in a draft, Buck, in terms of talent, but it's more than that to really work together with a quarterback like Joe Burrow.
Absolutely. And that's, something that a lot of teams are going to have to work their way through the process of figuring out the quarterback situation for a lot of these teams. A lot of teams in flux right now. I know Stafford's
Yeah.
coming back. I know Derek Carr's coming back. It
Yeah.
is expected right now as we sit here on March the 6th. Saints still have a lot of work to do to get under the cap at this point in time. But now that now that the Matt Stafford domino is kind of in place, and we know that that is going to hold serve in Los Angeles, Sam Darnold becomes the next biggest quarterback domino
Sure.
with free agency. And the Minnesota Vikings opted not to franchise tag him. Doesn't mean that he can't return at this point in time, but it does lead to an interesting conversation about that specific player because I think in most years, Greg, the best available quarterback would be the best available free agent, but that's not necessarily the case this year with Sam Darnold, even though I think he did a great job in last year's system, even when the offensive line situation around him started to devolve and you had the injury at left tackle that kind of threw them off, and he didn't have his two worst games were their two most important games at the end of the season and against Detroit
Right.
and in the playoffs. But I wonder how you view the player and how well he operated in Kevin O'Connell's scheme last year versus other teams who might be considering his services.
Well, I think you just nailed it, Buck. I think there's probably a sense around the league that he played well because of the scheme.
Hmm.
And Kevin O'Connell's obviously a really good offensive coach, really does a great job with the schematics of the pass game. Obviously, they've got one of the two best receivers in football in Justin Jefferson and a really good number two in Addison. Hawkinson comes back. I mean, they've got really good players, really good scheme. I think there's a sense that, yes, Darnold's gifted. He's 6'4", 225, throws the ball really well, has mobility. I mean, the traits are there, but I think because of the track record prior to last year, I mean, don't forget the year prior, he was a backup quarterback in the league for the 49ers. So I think there's a clear sense that he was very scheme specific, and that might be a little bit buyer beware. In other words, he might not be at the 45, $50 million a year range that I'm sure he would love to get, and his agent should ask for. I mean, that's their job.
Mm.
But my sense is that, and I loved what Donald did last year. That offense with him executing it was a joy to watch throughout the season. But I think there's a definite sense that he was very much coach and scheme specific, and that he's not going to get the 45, $50 million. And that sets up a chance where he could well be back in Minnesota. You don't know.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Minnesota expects him to come in closer to 30, which would keep their door open
For
to
sure.
potentially bringing him back on, maybe not a 4-year deal, but maybe a 2-year deal with sufficient guaranteed money that
And
makes that puts him in a good position to
yeah,
succeed, right?
they have an interesting situation because they did draft J.J. McCarthy, I believe, with the 11th pick last year. Now he missed the entire year, so he still, in a sense, would be a rookie this season. Um, but he did go through all their off-season work, so he certainly understands their offense the best you can understand it without actually executing it on the field. Um, he's a sharp kid, pretty gifted. I guess we'll find out because you know how owners get involved in this too. When you're talking about paying that kind of money, owners get involved. We're not talking about lower level free agents here. Um, they could easily say, and I don't have any inside information, so I don't want people to think that, hey, I'm saying something that's going to happen.
Mm.
Um, they could easily say to Kevin that, hey, you drafted J.J. McCarthy with the 11th pick in the draft. You do a great job with your offense and quarterbacks. He's the guy. Now it's you make him into a really good player. We drafted him 11th. So we don't know how all that's going to play out because if you re-sign Darnold, they can say whatever they want publicly, but Darnold would be the quarterback. They're not going to go into the sea. They're not going to sign Darnold, let's say at 33 million, just throwing out a number, and then say we have a quarterback competition. They wouldn't,
Right.
I doubt they would be doing that.
No, Atlanta is kind of an exception, right, with what they did with Kirk Cousins last year, and then ultimately it sounds like he had some injuries that also
Yeah.
were attributed to why they sat him down and went with Michael Penix with the eighth overall pick. But it's pretty rare that you see a circumstance like that where you pay a quarterback 100 million plus in guaranteed money and also draft a quarterback eighth overall.
Yeah, and again, I know why they did that because I've spoken to people, but the bottom line is Penix is now their quarterback.
Yeah.
Even if Kirk Cousins were to come back there, well, I guess he's technically still under contract, right?
They
Yeah.
they were talking at the combine about they're pretty comfortable with him as the backup, so it doesn't sound
Yeah,
like they're
but the point is he's the backup.
right.
I mean, I don't think there's a competition at the position right now. I mean, Penix would have to fail in order for Kirk Cousins to be reinstated as the starter. My sense is there's no competition that Penix is the starting quarterback going into the offseason programs.
Right, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make at
Yeah.
this point in time. A couple of different players for the Philadelphia Eagles, Greg, that I know that you are intimately familiar with, the
Yep.
defending Super Bowl champion. I didn't hear many people working Milton Williams into their analysis, except for Greg Cosell on this very podcast, because he is an impactful player. But they have so many impactful players along the defensive line, Greg, that it's easy to get caught up in the names at the top and
Yep.
not necessarily see all the different pieces and parts unless you're watching them as intricately as you do
Yeah.
on a regular
Well,
basis.
I was onto Milton Williams when he came out of La Tech, and I really loved his tape, have watched his development because I see every Eagles game in detail, as you know, Buck. And I've been talking about him for 3 years, and this year he really took a step forward. And I know people say, "Well, Jalen Carter was playing opposite him," but the point is all that means is he gets some one-on-ones, but you got to win the one-on-ones. There's a lot of guys that get one-on-ones that don't win the one-on-ones.
Yeah,
He was a really impactful D tackle this year in the league, not just for the Eagles, but in the league. Um, and I think it showed up for people who don't follow the Eagles closely. They got to see it in the playoffs. I mean, he was just a dominant player at times throughout the playoffs, and he was like that all season long. And my guess is, um, I haven't heard the Eagles make an announcement that, oh, he's going to walk, but my guess is he'll be priced out of the Eagles' ability to pay him. And I think that there'll be 4 or 5 teams that will be very, very interested in Milton Williams because not only is he a really good player, but he's multi-positional. And that means that he can be deployed in different ways with different defensive fronts and teams like that. So, I think, again, I don't follow the numbers, so I don't know what that means for a D
sure.
tackle, but I think Milton Williams will be in meaningful demand, and there'll be 4 or 5 teams that absolutely will want to have serious conversations with his agent.
Yeah, and just for the audience's edification, Greg and I don't get into numbers on this podcast. We're talking more about the players and the system
Right.
they're coming from and what they can do potentially elsewhere in the NFL, which brings us to Sweat, Greg, who made himself a lot of money throughout the course of the season, particularly in that Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs. The way that the Eagles platoon essentially their front, I think allows them to have guys at their best and have fresher legs
Yes.
they work their way through these
Yeah.
games. So I'm just curious as to what you think of Sweat's skill set, because if if he hits the open market as he is expected to, it's likely that he's going to be playing a higher percentage of snaps elsewhere than he was in Philadelphia.
I'm so Buck, that to me is the best point, and that's a great point because Sweat did not have a good year in 2023, and then he came back this year and had a very good season, and again played very well in the playoffs. But I think you have to be careful. And again, another player I've watched probably every one of his snaps as a Philadelphia Eagle. Um, you have to be careful that if you sign him, just what you said. I don't believe because of the injuries he's faced throughout his career. He came into the league with a really serious knee injury that, that happened, I guess, in college. And he even hurt his knee in high school, if memory serves me correctly, because he was a top three recruit in the country, regardless of position, coming out of, I believe, the Virginia Beach area. I think that general area. I could be wrong on the town. But, you know, with the Eagles, he was able to play as somewhat of a rotational player. And I think if you sign him, you have to understand that that's likely what he is at this point in his career, given the injuries that he has, the mileage on his body. Um, he's going to be 28, something along those lines. Not that that's old, but, with all the other factors, you can't sign him with the expectation that every week he's playing 70 snaps because I don't think you get the best out of him if you think that way. So I think you have to be really careful when you sign him to you have to deploy him in a way that maximizes his strengths.
Hmm. Maximizing strengths is easy to do when you've got players who have versatility. And you mentioned Javon Holland as a five-tool player earlier at the start of the podcast. He's coming out of the Dolphins system with Anthony Weaver, who last year came over from Baltimore. And the Dolphins, had relative levels of success. Obviously, injuries to the quarterback position kind of derailed how their season ultimately went. But I wonder what you thought of him within that system and how you project him as a potential free agent for a variety of different teams. We'll say the Titans and Denard Wilson, for example, who
Well,
might view him in a similar
yeah.
deployment.
Keep in mind, he's been through a lot of systems. The year prior in 2023, he was in Vic Fangio's system, which is sort of going through the league a bit more now because of the success Vic has had. But not only that, because it's a really good system and it sort of plays to where the league is right now with all these split safety, two high safety structures. The league has moved clearly more in that direction away from single high structures. But Holland he's a complete safety. He can play on the back end. You can use him in the box. He can blitz. He can cover. He's just a complete safety. And with his background in many different systems, he's capable of fitting in anywhere. So he's one of those guys for the safety position that you don't have to worry, well, he only fits in this kind of system. He can do anything. It's funny. I mentioned five tool because I had a conversation this past off season over the summer with a coach in the NFL. And it's funny. Sometimes when I talk to coaches that I know, they start asking me stuff like they say, okay, so who are your top five safety? They throw this stuff out and we get into these great conversations. And it's funny because that was that conversation. The coach who spends a lot of his time, with safeties, said to me, okay, who are your safeties? And I'm actually pulling up my notes right now because what we went through like safeties, and he called them five tool. And he said Holland and Fitzpatrick are the two that really are those guys. There's others that are close. Winfield's, close to that category. Kyle Hamilton would be in that category to some degree. Matthew was, he's closer to the end than the beginning. But Holland and Minkah Fitzpatrick are the two guys that are really the five tool guys that can do anything.
Yeah, and what it's worth, Tyrann Mathieu released by the New Orleans Saints earlier this week. Be curious to see where he lands in
Yeah,
that phase of
and
his
that's an
career.
age, money thing, I'm sure. It's a combination. It's like Darius Slay getting released by the Eagles. Slay actually had a really, really good playoff run. He was a little up and down during the season, but he had a great playoff run. And so that's what people remember, and he played really, really well. But he's going to be 35, and he makes a lot of money.
Yeah, that's the business of the NFL for sure. Greg, you're uniquely equipped, I think, to answer this question about Aaron Rodgers because everything that you hear
I
externally
don't know
about
if anybody's equipped to answer any questions about Aaron Rodgers, but I appreciate that.
brother, ain't that the truth? I mean, see, I started watching that Netflix documentary and I left with more questions than I got
Right,
answered
right,
out of that.
right,
But
right.
I think from the purposes of you've done a lot of his games
Oh
across
yeah.
his career, you are you are not only signing Aaron Rodgers the player, but you are signing Aaron Rodgers essentially he comes with his own system, if that makes sense, the way that I view him, because he runs a lot of the offense, and that's been something that
That's
he's
a
been given
great point.
the
Well,
freedom to do. So I wonder how you view him, understanding that he's in an
well,
advanced stage, but he comes with that particular note.
let's understand a couple of things. Let's put aside the other stuff that's fun to talk about, when he's on Pat McAfee. That's all fun to talk about, but that's not relevant for right now. You're dealing with a guy that arguably you could make the argument that he's the best thrower of the football, just pure thrower of a football we've ever seen. Um, he's certainly top three. So you're talking about a guy that just as a thrower of the football and understanding of the game is at an incredibly high level. That's what you're dealing with. But when you said what you said, it made me think of a coach telling me later in Peyton Manning's career, once he was Peyton Manning and was obvious Hall of Famer and the whole deal, that if you became the new offensive coordinator working with Peyton Manning, that you're running Peyton Manning's system, not your system. And I think you'd almost have to take that approach with Aaron Rodgers. You're basically running Aaron Rodgers' system because he's so intelligent. I once had a coach who worked with him in Green Bay for years tell me that when Aaron Rodgers came to the bench after a series and they sat down, and they started looking at, the iPad, whatever it is everybody looks at now to see what they did. He said, Aaron Rodgers told me this is what the coach said, I'm paraphrasing, what seven different players were doing on defense. He said, I'd never seen that before in my life. There's no way that a quarterback can see seven different players on defense. And he said, Aaron Rodgers could do that all the time. So you're dealing with a guy that's incredibly smart, incredibly aware, sees the game at a really high level. Does he have the same legs he used to have? No, of course he doesn't. Now we don't know through an off season, can he get back and be, he's not going to be what he was 7, 8 years ago, but can he be, more than functional? But you're dealing with a guy that's incredibly intelligent, throws a beautiful ball. You almost have to run his system and let him feel like he's in control. The only thing is, and I have no way to know this, neither do you really, other than talking to people. You just don't know for a team all the other stuff that's involved. Like,
Right.
do you want to deal with that? Do you not want to deal with it? I don't have an answer for that. I don't, in some ways I don't care about that. I'm just talking about the player.
Yeah, I think most teams don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, they may not.
It's a difficult situation to kind of wade your way through because there's no question that I think to me Greg personally he started to show at the end of the year the further that he got removed from the injury that the potential is still there to be more than functional, and functional was kind of where it was
Yeah.
last year. 2 years removed from the Achilles, I think that there's reason to believe that he could
And
at least gain a little more traction.
and that because of the way he was spoken about, and he follows everything because he's doing TV and all that now. So he follows everything. That this year, whoever signs him, he's going to have a massive chip on his shoulder,
Yeah.
and he's just super gifted. I mean, that's I've seen 90 to 95% of his games over the years, and you're dealing with a guy that is just a ridiculous thrower of the football. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Be an interesting free agency for sure. It just gets us 1 point closer through the offseason and closer to the NFL draft. And of course, 1 week closer to the install live show. We'll
Yeah.
be able to talk about free agents and the draft class when Greg comes to town on Friday, May the 2nd. Greg, we've almost sold 100 tickets. We've only got 250 tickets to sell. So people
Right.
better get to 1045thezone.com right now as soon as they're listening to this podcast and go get their damn tickets.
Well, hopefully, we'll keep getting closer to the draft. I mean, the draft probably still seems far away, but as we get closer and closer, and the Titans' intentions sort of become more well known, I think I think we have to get through the SEC tournament this week, Buck, and then I think because that's obviously a big deal because it's in Nashville.
Oh yeah, well you got the Lady Vols handed out ass kickings last night. You got Tennessee taking an unfortunate loss to Ole Miss.
Yeah, the Alabama-Florida game last night, which I watched a good amount of, which was an unbelievable college game.
Yeah, it's just such a fun conference this year, Greg. I
Yep.
know you've gotten to take in the SEC tournament here in town, and we're looking forward to doing the show live from it. As a matter of fact, in the not too distant future. But it's always good to catch up with you, my friend. Good to see you last week. Enjoyed our dinner with Kirby Allen Kirby as well.
Yep.
Two dinners for you with Kirby
Oh,
and
I know. I'm still trying to survive that.
it takes a full year to recover,
I
so
know, I know.
ready to do
Yeah.
it again by the time we get to the combine next. But thank you as always for the time, Greg.
Thanks, Buck.